It's now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. He is a member of Convocation with a Master of Arts from the University of Western Australia. Patrick Cornish has been a keen member of what he sees as the UWA family for well over 50 years. He's maintained his links, great and small, with the campus that has the seek wisdom as a motto. Patrick has sought many things other than wisdom here. That's a dangerous statement, Patrick, but does consider it wise for both head and heart to keep in touch with the place that gave you a good start in life. Tonight he will address the topic, Launchpad for a Storyteller. Please welcome our guest speaker this evening, Mr. Patrick Cornish.
Good evening to members of the UWA family. Good manners compels me to single out Vice-Chancellor Professor Schwarter. Chancellor, I call him Bob because he's a contemporary of mine, and the Warden, Doug McGee. Would Patrick be guest speaker? Doug was wondering a few weeks ago. His colleague could have replied, oh yes, no problem getting him to talk. The problem is getting him to stop. Well, I promise that Doug will not need to be unfastening a fire extinguisher this evening. I will speak as concisely as you have every right to expect from someone whose job entails trimming, sometimes hacking a clear path through verbiage. In the lead up to becoming a freshie here half a century ago, I had plenty of what these days is called attitude, convinced of my great capacity to tease my way into and out of any situation. Humility, I alleged, was one of my greatest assets. Today, well into my 70th year, I have in most ways progressed from attitude to gratitude. This evening I shall touch on just a few of the good things that have come my way via this university. One day in the sexy 60s, as an arts student sitting a few meters west of where I stand this evening, I had a revelation. The word, as you know, means a drawing back of the veil. My English tutor was giving me a piece of advice that changed my life. Calm down, Patrick, he said. You have a gift, but calm down, I replied. I don't want to calm down. I'm not the only person in this tutorial group who tells jokes, you know. It turned out he wasn't speaking about jokes. He was referring to my writing, assignments, essays. What he meant was, you don't need to be so excitable, trying to be clever all the time. Well, I took his counsel. I've thought of him many times since that day and gave silent thanks to him, particularly just over a year ago, while writing his obituary for the West Australian. This is Professor John Hay, who, after leaving Perth, went on, as many of you will know, to a distinguished career in the Eastern States, including as a Vice-Chancellor. On that day, decades ago, he had drawn back the veil from my self-satisfaction. During correspondence with his family in connection with the obituary, I mentioned merely that I had reason to be grateful to him. That's an understatement, a device we journalists sometimes learn only rather late in life. After graduating BA in 1969, I became a professional storyteller, a newspaper reporter. It's the perfect job for a person with curiosity. Even these days, I occasionally designate myself Patrick the Pest. But thank you, Professor Hay, for your candor. I can't think of any single conversation I ever had in my teens that made such an impact. But my purpose tonight is not to dwell on my own conversations, but on the wide range of connections that this university has offered to all and sundry. The voices I and tens of thousands of others have heard and respected. I'll limit my brief survey to things for which I can vouch firsthand. And I'd like to end with a couple of suggestions on how UWA might broaden the process of giving voice, of spreading worthwhile stories more widely. So more on that just before I finish. Connections. The formal ones that stemming from the subject we're enrolled in don't need to be covered here. It's the sheer diversity of options that is my terrain right now, the things in which we do not enroll. So this should remove any apprehension among you that you are about to endure a recitation of degrees conferred, academic hurdles cleared, or B's for essays that I felt should have been A's. My first example is from the recent past. I made a fascinating discovery almost 4 years ago. I was recounting the life of a former lecturer described for me as one of the liveliest and most accessible UWA staff of her generation. I'm used to hearing praise, but in my work I try to maintain some sort of critical distance, resisting hyperbole. After talking to a couple more people, however, I realized this person was being given no more than her due. Professor Philippa Madden. I was writing her obituary. She had died a few months short of her 62nd birthday, a cruelly premature loss. I never met her, but I wish I had. It was one prominent aspect of her academic life that struck me most forcibly. She had been founding director of the Center for the History of Emotions. Emotions. Who knew? Who knew we should study those? My heartiest congratulations to whoever joined with Professor Madden in establishing such an entity. So, in 2014, having asked the center's then director what sort of things were investigated, he replied, "We examine the long history behind questions such as, when is it a good thing to feel anger? Is it all right for men to cry? And what do we mean by being in love?" Last time I checked the UWA website, I read that the Center for the History of Emotions discusses, in a wider sense, how we best understand the roles of nature and culture in the formation of emotions, both individual and communal. And so now, going back a few decades, it is with emotion that I glance in the rearview mirror, recalling how I felt rather than thought from the first day I set eyes on this campus. First emotion? Excitement. I'm at university. It's 1966. Com-Schol holder, Commonwealth Scholarship. I've been chosen to be first-year rep on my faculty committee. Bring it on! But I had boarded the wrong train. For years, I have wondered why I enrolled in engineering. I'd like to be able to blame my father, who endorsed the choice, or point to the lack of career guidance at my school. The fact is, however, that the buck stopped with me. The applied scientific study and technical drawings likewise stopped after first year. Teenage emotions then felt and expressed disappointment at failure. From then on, I was careful to check that on annual enrollment day, I was buying the correct ticket. I consoled myself with regular utterance of a newly discovered mantra: learning what you do not want to do is as important as learning what you do want to do. Moving on a year, I did not need 12 months in the wrong location to learn I did not want to be conscripted into the army. In England, I had been a hopeless member of my school cadet corps. Khaki was definitely not my color. But by 1968, there were more serious problems. While marching along Murray Street in the city with fellow students protesting against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, I was shoved by a man with opposing views. That upset me. I was generally given to proclaiming that if my marble were picked in the lottery system based on birth dates, I would become a conscientious objector. It was a bold claim. Thank goodness I never had to prove true to my word. They didn't pick me. If being shoved by an unsympathetic stranger in Murray Street scared me, imagine how I would have fared enduring disapproval, perhaps physical discomfort, at the hands of the authorities, let alone in combat with the Viet Cong. Emotion at that point, fear. Impure and simple fear. I must pull this narrative back to the subject of storytelling. The student newspaper, Pelican, was becoming a consuming interest. Much of what we published was trivial and self-indulgent. In 1968, next one please, new printing techniques arrived. We went overboard to show what this could look like. Much more substantially, one day I was among those in our tiny office in Hackett Hall who listened to Guild Councillor Sue Boyd while she told us something important. 2 students in 2 years had died after being hit by cars while running or walking across Stirling Highway. One of them, a 19-year-old girl resident of St. Catherine's College, was well known to Sue. The university and the main roads department, Sue insisted, must act. A bridge, tunnel, something. Here was a matter of life and death, much closer to us than Vietnam. Here's something worth reporting on. In March 1969, Sue, who had just become the Guild of Undergraduates' first female president, led a sit-down protest on the highway. It was Friday afternoon, peak hour. In the following year, long after I'd left Perth to start a journalism career in Wales, a tunnel was built. One afternoon, years later, I listened to Sue on ABC Radio, chatting about her distinguished diplomatic career, which included being ambassador to Vietnam, among other postings. The emotion now uppermost in my mind was pride. At UWA, she made history, and I had been there to see her do it and be among the legion who supported her. 2 other experiences of mine at UWA are worth mentioning. There's so much theatrical about university. The mortarboards at graduation ceremonies, for example. Those gowns of many colors. In 1981, I was tutoring in literature here when I noticed my students' attention had drifted outside the window to a couple of peacocks strutting onto the stage of the new Fortune Theatre. I paused, waited, thought to myself, I would probably have done the same. Proust and Jane Austen can't compete with the majestic colors of peacock feathers. From this diversion, I wrote a play titled Rise and Shine, about a philosophy tutorial taken over by a cleaning woman. Merely a lunchtime production at the Octagon Theatre, but it was a source of pride. The other experience that I mentioned was learning Japanese, also in 1981. I was planning to visit the country later that year. Gratitude is certainly central here because there were then no tuition fees. And that after more than 5 years of a Liberal Party government in Canberra. It is not within my remit to get into the subject of university financing. But let me just say I feel very much for the many students who today have to go into debt to enroll. This is one reason why I occasionally volunteer to give back to UWA in various ways, such as meeting current students and phoning prospective postgrads. Only just within my remit is to mention online learning. My general, grumpy old man view is that such contemporary technological aids make me wonder, what are universities for? To acquire information? To meet strangers and learn something about their hopes and fears? Many of you here this evening have a better handle on this topic than I do, and in any case, people of my age and skepticism need to face the fact that in the 1960s, we did not have the chance to learn online. We would surely have embraced at least some aspects. It does make some sorts of study more flexible and therefore easier to deliver and to imbibe. I think of links on screen that might include a film of some action, for example. I have no evidence that being physically on campus, walking past the library, crossing James Oval, improves education in the wider sense, but emotionally, I suspect that it often could. Presence means more human interaction. In this context of what constitutes learning and discovery, I borrow once more from the rich world of metaphor. This is from the poet W.B. Yeats. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I used this quote in 2013 in the Guild of Undergraduates Centenary book, titled 2 and Sixpence, which I edited. I subscribe to this sentiment just as keenly now. The flame burns still. To wrap up, I have the gall to offer a suggestion for the university's media people who work for online publication and print magazines. While I'm often delighted to note the power and glory of graduates who have distinguished themselves, the social democrat in me makes a plea for our staff writers to cover the experiences of ordinary, workaday people who have been educated on this campus. Track them down. They're not hard to find. If the idea were to be tried, I'd volunteer to write the first one. Each month, perhaps, we could feature half a dozen, about 400 words each, with a photo. Perhaps Convocation could have a role here. We could name this section Cast from Crawley. But look, I spent so long studying literature here that I'm inclined to be a little more ambitious. I give you the final sentence of George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. That things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So my preferred title on such a biographically oriented segment for a UWA publication is Lives Revealed, for allowing me to reveal some of why this university has been a major thread of my life as a storyteller, equipping me for matters of intellect and emotion. Thank you.
Well, that's certainly from the heart and a wonderful example of a person deeply in love with this university and wanting to tell a story. Patrick, thank you so much. I have, well, not surprisingly, it wasn't a wine, women or song or anything like that that Patrick requested as a thank you gift. In fact, he requested nothing, but not surprisingly, a voucher from UWA Publishing is very, very appropriate for this man.